All right, you guys, this one's going to be difficult because we've got to talk about... we have to talk about political violence, which is not going to be an easy topic. But first... let's get into the fan art section. Let's get into that one real quick. So this one is from Sarantane. Thank you very much. It says a witchy sketch work in progress. Yes. But why is that? Why is that slime Suris getting out of the bottle? We're farked. The next one we have here is from Weck. No context given, but very happy Nekosaurus with a very happy evil slime. And then the last one is from Biscuit Bully. Infinite slime. Please don't think it's supposed to be mean. I put a lot of effort into this. Oh, I don't think it's supposed to be mean. If you cut the slime in half, you just create 2 slime. Every time you cut the slime, it divides infinitely. As always, everyone, thank you all for your fan art submissions. If you want your fan art to be shown in a future video, the best way to do so is to drop into the fan art section of the Discord. With that said, if you haven't subscribed already or hit the bell notification icon, please consider doing so. But to now... we need to go ahead and talk about violence. So, I'm going to go ahead and get a couple disclaimers out of the way first. The very first one is, I do not condone violence. I would like to live in a world where nobody has to resort to it, even in self-defense. Because in a perfect world, the violence that requires the self-defense doesn't happen either. I would prefer that world. And I don't condone anybody who watches this video, or anybody who goes into my chat, or anybody who shares this video, or what have you. I don't condone anybody engaging in violence. That said, we do need to talk about it by taking a step back and look at violence from a purely utilitarian perspective when exercised politically. And specifically in reference to something that somebody who I respect a lot has said. So, for those of you who may not be aware of who Seth Andrews is, he runs the Thinking Atheist podcast. He's also author of a lot of books. And he's a person who I have a lot of respect for. An absolute fart ton of respect for. I love his work. I've been on his podcast talking about polyamory. So I'm going to be critiquing not Seth, but I'm going to use the words that Seth has said as the springboard for this conversation. So let's go ahead and take a look here first at this tweet from my friend Wolf. Said, so it's actually interesting that we have laws about this, and if it went to court, there's a strong case to be made that the Nazi is the aggressor, even with his hand up. Clothes our speech as ruled by the Supreme Court. He spoke aggressively. The other man defended himself. And for those who don't know, it is the video of the guy putting his hand up and then getting boofed on the way down. So, before we get into any of the nitty-gritty, before we get into what Seth said specifically, I do want to point something out. If you were to feel like you needed to engage in violence in any way, shape, or form, attacks to the head, probably not the best course of action. Only because the likelihood of permanent damage and or death is incredibly high, and that is not a burden that you should be putting on yourself, nor a thing you should be taking away from someone else. If you've ever heard the term punch drunk, there are people who literally have suffered so much damage to the head that they have not been able to operate in a sober state anymore. So, just throwing that out there, don't do attacks to the face if you can help it. Now we got that out of the way, let's get into what Seth Andrews says before we get into my take, and then we start looking at a couple of theories here. So, this is from Seth, and he says, for years, But I've been convinced that sucker-punching neo-Nazis isn't how we defeat the poison of white supremacy. We stretch to justify it because it feels good. But this type of assault is scarily arbitrary. Your clothes provoked me, and it stoops to raging lawlessness. So, I have a couple of issues with this. I'll address a couple of the specifics before we get into the broader conversation. But your clothes provoked me. If my clothes say something like, I kill gay people, then yes, your clothes provoked me. Literally, that's what they did. If you wear a symbol that is globally recognized to be the symbol of eugenics, hate crimes, killing of Jews, and destroying the lives of Romani and gay people, then yes, your clothes are a type of speech, and what you have communicated is a threat. So, I want to agree with Seth. I want to agree with this idea that speech is one category and violence is another category, and we respond to speech with speech and violence with violence. But I believe that these two things are not categories so much as they are scopes. There is a point at which speech becomes violence. Case in point, Hitler literally never killed a single person in his life outside of Hitler. But he is responsible for the deaths of millions. His speech led directly to violence. Else, we would never have had an issue with Hitler, just the people he commanded. But no duh, we would have issue with the person who actually commanded the Third Reich, because his actual speech, his words, are what incited things. We also need to ask ourselves a question: how do Nazis gain power? Because typically it's not because they engaged in a violent coup. Typically, they gain power through the legal system. They gain power by changing the political and social zeitgeist such that their ideas are mainstream and allowed. They literally use speech as a tool to become more and more normalized in a society until they have the power to exercise violence. I don't know how many times I have to say this, but the distinction between speech and violence is not a distinction of categories. It is a distinction of scope. There is a point at which speech manifests as violence, either at the macro level in terms of political scale, or the micro level when it manifests as stochastic terrorism. The Overton window shifts with words, and the types of people that we are okay with violence being used on shifts alongside that Overton window. If we allow the Overton window to shift a certain way, then violence gets justified on certain people. Let's go ahead and get a couple other things out of the way before I run into some more groundwork. To those of you who want to use the defense that speech is a protected thing in the United States, we should honor that, and that should be the most respected thing in the world. I want to live in your world. I want to live in that world of naivete. I do. I really do. And while I cannot condone violence in any way, shape, or form, not only because I find violence to be abhorrent, but also because I am a content creator, and I cannot support violence. But when I take a step back and look at things from a utilitarian perspective, and I look at the idea of seeing everything through the legal lens, well, this is protected free speech. Okay, cool. Slavery was protected in the United States at one point. Segregation was protected in the United States at one point. The things that are currently protected by our legal system is not, has never been, and will never be an argument on its face. When our argument is about the morality, the ethics of an action, all of that, the legality takes a step back. There are areas where the legal word for rape requires penetration specifically, and not just provoked sexual assaults that are not consented to, or sexual actions that are not consented to. The broadness or the narrowness of scope that we use is purely a matter for legalese and lawyers to figure out on their own. I am not concerned with laws here. I am concerned with ethics and utility. So, let's go ahead and run through some stuff. The initial statement will always be violence against speech is bad. That is the vague statement. Violence against speech is bad. But there are no specifics there, no caveats. That is far too vague. So we need to define some things. What does speech mean? What entails speech? Well, speech can be the clothes you wear, the symbols you show, the words you speak. These are all forms of speech. Speech is any way in which we communicate as far as this is concerned. Because it can't just be the words you say. If I use sign language to tell you I'm going to kill you 15 different ways, that's no less a threat than if I said it verbally. Now, we need to define violence. So what do we consider violence? I'd say punching somebody, restraining someone, locking them up, starving them. Things like this I would consider to be forms of violence. If you don't think that locking somebody up is a form of violence, then sure, I'll just lock you up real quick. And if you don't think that I've committed some type of bad action against you, then that's your own business and your own kink. And I'm not here to shame that one because you don't have the one kink that I will shame. So if we agree that those things are violence, then let's ask ourselves a question. What country likely has the most authority when it comes to Nazis? I'm sure everybody in the chat will be able to answer this very quickly. And I understand this. I'm not looking at this through a legal scope. I'm looking through this just to have an example. Soccer has already got it in one. It would be Germany. Germany engages in violence against Nazis. But wait, you say. You want to stop me real quick and say, no, Germany only arrests people who have the swastika shown on themselves because that is an illegal thing, and so they get taken in by the police when they show a swastika in Germany. To which I answer, yes, but we've already agreed that physically assaulting, restraining, locking someone up against their will, or starving someone, these are all forms of violence. So yes, even if the police don't engage in violence the way that we in America would understand police brutality, they are still engaging in a form of violence to people who show the swastika. Now, why? Because the swastika is a form of speech. What does that speech communicate? Well, it communicates allegiance with the Third Reich. It communicates allegiance with Nazi ideology. Well, what is Nazi ideology? Well, it's a type of fascistic ideology. It's palingenetic in nature. It's ultra-nationalistic, usually, in nature. But it also communicates things like anti-Semitism, anti-minorities, ableism. And if you don't believe me, the Nazis literally killed a bunch of disabled people. So I would call that at least somewhat ableist. It communicates very many things which are all forms of violence. And so you go, okay. You know what? Okay, Germany does the thing. Maybe we should do that specifically with people who wear the swastika, people who we can literally look at and go, okay, cool, you're doing a Nazi thing. Don't do the Nazi thing. You're coming in, you're getting arrested because of that. We agree with that then, at least if we've gotten this far. But what have you actually agreed to? Well, you've agreed that violence against Nazis is okay. That's what you've agreed to. And if you don't believe me, let's backtrack real quick. Locking someone up is a form of violence. The police have done it. The police aren't any more special than you or I. They've locked up a Nazi, so they've done a violence to a Nazi for being a Nazi, for using Nazi speech, which we agreed the swastika is Nazi speech. So if we agree that the swastika is Nazi speak and it's okay that the violence happened to the Nazi, then what's the actual distinction there? I'll get to that in a second. Let's ask ourselves a question. Are threats a form of violence? I would argue yes. My logic is this. If you aim a gun at me, I do not care whether or not the trigger is pulled. I care that the aiming took place at all. Threats are as much a type of violence as actual physical violence. What this is called is escalation. If you and I are standing in a subway together and you threaten to knock my lights out, you have escalated us. We have gone from a non-violent positioning of ourselves to a violent positioning of ourselves. So threats are violence. Some types of speech can be considered threats, like the swastika. Some types of speech can also be considered incitement for violence. How will we respond to incitement for violence? Is incitement for violence a type of violence? I would argue that it is. If you incite violence, or you engage in threats, you have engaged in two types of speech that have crossed the threshold, that scope threshold, from mere words to violent rhetoric, which is another step away from the physical violence. Because again, these are not issues of category. These are issues of scope. Now, if you tell me that actually you should only ever respond to violent rhetoric with nothing and wait until they've engaged in the violence first, then I sincerely hope you're okay with living the rest of your life with a hole in your chest. Because all you're asking is to get hit first. You are merely telling people to take the bat to the head first when the bat has been brandished, as opposed to engaging in self-defense. So is a swastika a type of threat or incitement? I would say yes. We have to ask ourselves, what does that symbol mean? What ideology does it represent? It represents an ideology of genocide. It represents an ideology of eugenics, torture, literally attempting to take over the world. So yes, when worn, when flown, when displayed, the swastika is very much, in every way, shape, and form, a threat to several people. Now, should individuals respond to these threats? This is where we circle back to that question about the police. If your answer is no, we need to get the police involved, well, you've already agreed these situations should be responded to with violence. Your distinction is that the violence must be state-sponsored specifically, which means your issue is with vigilante justice, but we have to ask ourselves why there. If it's because police are uniquely informed or trained, we have a sad number of police officers that will show up at the 3%er rallies. We have to understand that several times we have found white supremacists in our police force. We have found people that have ideologies that are, if not one-to-one, adjacent enough to what we would consider Nazi ideology, and they are in our police force. They are the ones making the determinations over whether or not you should arrest somebody who happens to have a swastika brandished out in the open. You have to also ask yourselves, do police make mistakes? Yes, they do. And we also understand that legal grants of power, if we're looking at this from an ethical and moral standard, don't really matter here. Reason being, from a legal perspective, we have allowed violence against women, we have allowed violence against minorities, we have allowed slavery, we have allowed Japanese internment camps, we have allowed, and the list goes on. Project MK Ultra was a state-sponsored thing we did to ourselves. So if we agree that the state sponsorship is not necessarily the golden token to allow certain forms of violence, the state must probably not be allowed to have a monopoly on violence, then where do we go from there? Do we argue that the public shouldn't be allowed to engage in violence in terms of violent threats against themselves, which we agree swastikas certainly are? We have to ask ourselves why. Is there something special about people who are in government that makes them distinct from us in making that determination? And if we agree that people in government are no different than you or me, we just happen to all agree to some extent that they should have the offices that they have, is there anything special about them? No, not really. There's no major distinction between one or the other. So if there's no real difference between the violence of a cop and the violence of a citizen, except how organized it can be, we're left with a different question. How, when, and why should violence be employed in regards to speech? And when do we accept that a state cannot be trusted with a monopoly on that violence? This is where the utilitarian perspective has to come in. So, hypothetical. A Nazi is free to be a Nazi in public. And what I mean by that is they're allowed to say the slogans, the 14 words. They're allowed to run around with swastikas. They're allowed to create their groups and swell their numbers. They are allowed to normalize themselves within society. How long do we let those words be heard before them just existing incites issues stochastically? A lot of studies have been done on lone wolf terrorism. At what point do we stop the person from saying, "Oh, please, won't someone rid me of this meddlesome priest?" At which point do we call them out on that and recognize that they are engaging in that moment of threshold crossing where they are hoping for the incitement to happen? As a streamer, I can ask a viewer specifically, I can say, Nakibri, please gift a sub to somebody on the channel. And that wouldn't be very effective. Okay, it's a priest because it's a reference specifically to something. I can do that, but that's not going to be very effective at getting what I want. But if what I want is for somebody to gift subs on the channel, I might say something like, hey, sure would be a shame if in the middle of this topic, someone were to start a hype train. That would really derail this entire conversation. And that may or may not create a scenario where people start dropping subs in the middle of the stream. But there's a higher likelihood that somebody will do so when I say it into the aether, hoping someone of any 100, 200, 300 people will respond to it, as opposed to telling someone to do it. So, and then of course Nakibri gives that a tier 1 sub, because we gotta prove me wrong. So do we just let it happen, or do we respond? And if we respond, how do we do so? Also, an anonymous gifter has just dropped a sub as well. Now a hype train is starting. I figured that was going to happen. This was part and parcel. I wanted money. I'm sorry. So now we have to ask ourselves, how do we respond to this? I say we respond to it by, within this hypothetical, when we are taking our step back, looking at these as video game characters and not as people. Velis Terena, thank you for gifting out 5 tier 1 subs. You have to depower the Nazi. You have to take the wind out of the sails of their speech. How do you do that? Well, when Nazis are scared to utilize their speech to talk about eugenics and racism and anti-Semitism, they can't spread like wildfire. But to which you might say, and rightly so, Avalon of Babylon, thank you for redeeming your points for an ara, you fucking degen. Ferdinand Fahrenheit, thank you very much for gifting out a tier 1 sub. You might say, in response to that, but sunlight is the best disinfectant. How would we know that they are this type of person unless we let them make a fool of themselves in public first? And after all, for the best ideas to win, don't all ideas need to be able to exist within the marketplace of ideas? To which my response is, we have never, and will never, be able to accurately measure what is a good or bad idea on the surface once spoken. We have no universal measuring device for the goodness or badness of ideas, and individual people are fairly awful at measuring that too. So what happens? I noted before that the way that Nazis gained power in Germany was by utilizing the legal system. They crept their way in. They used their rhetoric. They emboldened their base. The violence didn't begin immediately. Hell, it took over 5 years for things to even start getting dicey. And of course, the Night of Long Knives happened and things got really dicey. But that's not important. The important part is recognizing that it was speech up until the point where the state was legally allowed to engage in violence against its own. Exposing ideas to the sunlight only kills bad ideas when those ideas are thoroughly depowered by one of two methods. Either by cunning rhetoric that is shown to completely smash the idea, or by violence. Now, here's the problem. Not everybody has access to cunning rhetoric. Theoretically, though, everybody has access to a form of violence. But now we run into another problem. If the public cannot tell what is a good idea or a bad idea, how does the public tell when to utilize violence? This is the reason why we can't use this idea, this video, or any of this conversation as a way to specifically say whether violence is good or bad. All we can do is analyze it from a utilitarian perspective. If we agree that sunlight is only a good disinfectant when there's another good idea that is argued with equal cunning and equal rhetoric, then sure. But how often is that equal cunning and equal rhetoric going to be available? And at what point do you turn a victim into a martyr? So, let's take the Richard Spencer situation. Remember when Richard Spencer got punched on camera? Do you remember how after Richard Spencer got punched on camera, a lot of his base started just flocking away from him? How the wind got taken out of his sails? Can we say that violence is a tool? Well, yeah, it's a tool that the state uses a lot. It's a tool that we have access to as well. So, with Richard Spencer, humiliating him, which could have been done with clever rhetoric, but it wasn't done in the several interviews he had leading up to the punch incident. Humiliating him didn't work. You know what did work? Getting him scared. Getting him so scared to go out in the public and say his ideas the way he was saying them before that he was seen by as a coward by his base. A thing that fascists love is shows of strength. And when you can no longer show your strength, that wind is sucked out of your sails completely. But that means now we need to get into the academics of things. We need to get into some theories about violence. So, okay. We accept that violence is a tool that sometimes needs to be wielded in self-defense when it comes to threatening statements or attire or things like that. We agree that that's a thing. So, how does violence get organized? There's some macro theories on this, there's some micro theories on this. There's a Marxist lens we can use called social conflict theory. This states that social systems reflect the vested interests of those who control the means of production. They control the resources. So our social system in America reflects the vested interests of those who own capital. Think of the Musks in the world, think of the Jeff Bezoses in the world, think of them. And now look at our current system and ask, how does it benefit them and not you? If you've come to the conclusion that, oh, wait a minute, the police basically exist to protect capital, then congratulations, we're on the right track. Let's keep going. Social conflict theory says that the people in power will use political and economic institutions to exploit groups who have less power. As a result, the rest of society becomes alienated or psychologically separated from people who control power over the means of production. When this happens to a particular degree, we stop seeing the Musks and the Bezoses and the Bill Gates as people like you or me, and we start seeing them as ideas to strive for. Once we've got to that point, they've been severely alienated from us in any marginal sense. How does this change usually? Well, usually, revolutions will occur to break down the social and economic structure between people in power and the people who are exploited to try to achieve a type of social equity and unity. This, of course, can happen to varying degrees and sometimes is successful and sometimes is not. Through the lens of functionalism, we can see society as an organism whose entire system has to be in good working order for systemic equilibrium to be maintained. But when there's a shock to that system, society becomes disoriented, allowing for collective violence. So if we use that lens, has there been any shocks to the system of our society in the past couple years? 3 or 4 maybe? That led to collective violence of any kind? I can think of a couple. George Floyd would have been one of them. The George Floyd incident happened, and of course the BLM protests came from that. Some of the protests turned into riots for various reasons, and now we have political violence being utilized for what purpose? Well, it was to communicate a message. And what was that message that ideally should have been heard loud and clear? It was the idea that we have a problem with our police force. A problem that it executes and imprisons minorities, specifically people of color, more often than it does people who look like me, honestly. What's another instance where this has happened, potentially? What's another point of time recently where there has been a shock to the social system that could have led to a decent chunk of violence? Now, there's a couple of them. January 6th being one of them. A moment in time where a literal attempted coup was utilized on our country and it wasn't very effective, and people like Marjorie Taylor Greene thought if they led the coup, it would have been fine. Interesting how she manages to keep power as a result of that. What about the Roe versus Wade decision? Isn't it very interesting how certain types of protests, speech, if you will, were outlawed when it came to Supreme Court justices in and around the Roe v. Wade decision happening? Almost as if people in power know that without us, they have nothing. And if it just so happens that they shock the system so much through the lens of functionalism, we can see that collective violence happens as a result of that system shock. I, for one, am honestly astounded that more violence did not erupt out of the Roe versus Wade decision than it did. There's another lens we can look at this from called mass society. This argues that violent social movements come from people who are isolated socially and from political institutions. People who are alienated are easily convinced to join radical or extremist movements. Think about it. You've been listening to this entire video, and I guarantee you your gears in your head have been spinning one way or the other. They've either been spinning in the direction of justifying yourself going out and committing a type of violent crime, or someone else, or they've been spinning in the direction of all the myriad of ways I'm wrong. If they've been spinning in the direction of doing a violence, then ask yourself a question. Do you think of yourself as isolated socially or politically? And if you found yourself in the position of the gears spinning the other way, arguing against me, ask yourself again. Do you find yourself isolated socially or politically? This is a point where I want to actually see in the comment section below, because I feel as though, and my theory is that people who are more prone to engaging in thoughts of doing a violence of any kind, irrespective of the fact that I've said multiple times in the video, I don't condone that, probably find themselves where they feel they are more isolated socially and politically. Whereas the people who are arguing against the things that I've been saying in this video probably think that they feel more enfranchised politically. I mean, in all honesty, I can throw a couple of examples here if I really need to. Most liberals and most bog-standard Republicans don't tend to resort to violence that often. But people who find themselves further on the left and therefore disenfranchised from the liberal Democrats that exist, and people who are in the alt-right and even further on the right tend to find themselves disenfranchised from their own political zeitgeist. And while I don't mean to engage in horseshoe theory, because I think horseshoe theory is crap, I do feel like those two sets of people would find themselves more disenfranchised and therefore potentially more prone to violence. You know, horseshoe theory is horse shit. The idea that the further you go on, the further you get into extremism, to the point where you can't tell a fascist from a communist is weird to me when there's literal markers within the ideologies that make them distinct. But, anywho, those are macro theories of political violence. There are a couple of micro theories I want to go over as well that we can use as lenses to understand violence as a tool. There's rational choice theory, which is a decision-making approach in which the decision-makers compare the extended utility of competing options and select the options that will produce the most favorable outcome. Political violence occurs when the benefits in participating in political violence outweigh the costs. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's go ahead and use an earlier form of violence I noted. Let's take starvation. So if you have a community of 300 people and they are being starved because they are in an enclosed society and the government of their enclosed society is not allowing them to get any food, or rather they might be rationing the food in such a way that nobody can get enough nutrients. So we agree the state is currently imposing a type of violence on them. Political violence then will occur when everybody in that society, or at least enough of them, have come to the conclusion that the risks are outweighed by the benefits. They're all going to die irrespective of what happens because they're all starving. But if all of them were to engage in a revolution against their government, then there's a potentiality that at least some of them, maybe even most of them, will live because they will have access to the stores that the bourgeoisie have kept away from them. Political violence occurring when the benefits of participating in the violence outweigh the costs. There's also the collective action theory, which explains, or tries to explain, why people would participate in rebellions. A person decides to or not to participate in a rebellion based on the benefits and cost. Generally, people decide to be free riders and not participate in rebellions. People will still receive the benefits of the rebellion, since the benefits are a public good. However, if people are expected to receive private goods like material rewards or power, that person needs to be expected to be a participant in the rebellion. I want you to take that collective action theory of violence and see if there's any moments in the last 5 years that this could apply to. I would argue this applies to, say, January 6th, whereas people who were more active participants got more of the fame, and therefore more of the social media attention, reaped more of the rewards, and had they been successful, would have even potentially, at least within their fantasies, been granted some positions of privilege. Again, these are fantasies more than anything. Whereas a lot of people just were part of the crowd, closer to free riders in this sense. There to swell the numbers, but not there to rock the boat. They're there to receive the benefits if they were to win, if the MAGA crowd were to gain access to the Capitol and maintain that access for an extended period of time without getting, United States armied. And then there's one last one I want to look at. Greed versus grievance. Greed versus grievance provides that there are two lines of explanation as to why people fight. Greed versus grievance would argue that, much like some things that we've argued before, there is a point in time where people are motivated by weighing their options. There's two lines in which you'll fight. If you're motivated by greed, well, you decide to join the conflict in an effort to better your personal situation. And you'll find that joining a rebellion of any kind of collective action, if those things are better for you individually than they are if you don't join, then that would increase your chances of joining. Individuals are said to be motivated by grievance when they fight over high inequality, a lack of political rights, or ethnic and religious divisions in society. So this is where it is less about personal benefit and more about personal grievance. Your state is not providing you with enough food. They are not providing you with enough resources. They are not providing you with enough rights, and therefore you engage in violence to get those rights given to you. Now, have there been points in time where violence has been used to great effect to spotlight a cause? Now, let me go ahead and clarify real quick. If you want to be the person that says violence solves nothing, I want to agree with you. And actually, you're right. Violence solves nothing because it, like many other things, are part of a tool set. The violence itself does not stop a conflict. It does not gain you the resources instantaneously, typically. So what does it do? Well, usually, historically, violence spotlights causes. January 6th has been used as a rallying cry for the MAGA movement for the past year and a half since it occurred. But on the flip side, George Floyd's death has been used as a rallying cry against racism since 2020. But there's another point in time where violence was used to spotlight some issues for the disenfranchised that we really need to talk about. Can you guys guess what we're going to talk about here? It happened in 1969. Let's go ahead and have a bit of a story time real quick. Let's talk about what happened in 1969. A time where violence had to be used to spotlight an issue and has led to the widespread rights of many individuals. The 1960s and preceding decades weren't exactly welcoming times for people who were lesbians, gay, bisexual, or transgender. Any solicitation of same-sex relations in places like New York City, considered liberal bastions, was illegal. As a result of this, people who were in gay bars would actually flock to clubs and bars and any place of refuge where they could go that would allow themselves to express themselves openly and socialize without worry. However, the New York State Liquor Authority penalized and shut down establishments that served alcohol to known or suspected LGBTQ individuals, arguing that the mere gathering of homosexuals was in and of itself disorderly. The first documented gay rights organization, the SHR, the Society for Human Rights, was founded in 1924. That's nightmarishly recent for a group of individuals who have existed for as long as we've had humans. 3 years before Stonewall, members of the Mannequin Society, which was another organization dedicated to gay rights, staged what was called a sip-in, where they openly declared their sexuality at taverns, daring the staff to turn them away and suing any establishments that did. When the Commission on Human Rights ruled that gay individuals had the rights to be served at bars, police raids were eventually reduced a little bit. However, now we need to move on to Stonewall. The Stonewall Inn was basically owned by a crime syndicate, the Genovese crime family. They controlled a lot of the Greenwich Valley gay bars, but in 1966, they purchased Stonewall, which was a straight bar, renovated it, and reopened it the next year as a gay bar. Stonewall was registered as a type of private bottle bar, which did not require a liquor license because patrons were supposed to bring their own liquor. Club attendees had to sign their names in a book upon entry to maintain the club's false exclusivity. The crime family would also bribe the New York City cops to ignore any activities happening within the club. This meant that there was no police interference there, so they were able to take care of everything without the police getting involved in people's gay lives. However, let's talk about Stonewall. It welcomed drag queens, who had a bitter reception at other gay bars and clubs at the time. It was also a nightly home for people who were runaway gay youths. People who were panhandled or engaged in a lot of shoplifting would also come in. It was one of the few gay bars that actually allowed dancing within its walls. Silly thing, I know, but it's there. Luckily, because of the crime family, raids were not as much of a fact of life in Stonewall as in several other places. However, raids were still a part of what would happen. Usually, corrupt police officers would tip off the mafia-run bars before raids would occur, which would allow owners to stash all of their alcohol that they sold without liquor licenses in the establishments and hide other illegal activities. In fact, the New York City Police Department had stormed Stonewall just a few days before a particular event happened. We're about to talk about that event. When police raided Stonewall Inn on the morning of June 28, it came as a surprise. The bar was not tipped off this time by a corrupt cop like they normally are. Armed with a warrant, police officers entered the club, roughed up patrons, found bootleg alcohol, arrested 13 people, including employees, and people who were violating the state's gender-appropriate clothing statute, because that was a fucking thing. Female officers would take suspected cross-dressing patrons into the bathroom in order to check their genitalia. Fed up with the constant police harassment and social discrimination, angry patrons and neighborhood residents hung around outside of the bar rather than disperse, and they became increasingly agitated as the events unfolded, and people were aggressively manhandled. At one point, an officer hit a lesbian over the head as he forced her into a police van. She shouted to onlookers to act, inciting the crowd to begin throwing pennies, bottles, and cobblestones, and any other objects they could at the police. Violence had escalated. Within a couple of minutes, a full-blown riot involving hundreds of people had begun. The police, a few prisoners, and a village voice writer barricaded themselves inside the bar, which the mob attempted to set on fire after breaching the barricade repeatedly. The fire department and riot squad were eventually able to douse the flames, rescuing those inside Stonewall and disperse the crowd. But the protests, sometimes involving thousands of people now, would continue in the area for 5 more days, flaring up at one point after the Village Voice published its account of the riots. The Stonewall Uprising might not have started as a gay rights movement. It was a galvanizing force for all LGBTQ political activism from that point forward. It led to numerous gay rights organizations coming into fruition, including the Gay Liberation Front, the Human Rights Campaign, and several others. On the one-year anniversary of the riots, on June 28th of 1970, thousands of people marched in the streets of Manhattan from the Stonewall Inn to Central Park in what was called the Christopher Street Liberation Day, which was America's first gay pride parade. The parade's official chant was "Say It Loud, Gay is Proud." And the rest of that is history, as it were. When you say that violence should never be utilized, violence is never the option, you have to ask yourself, how many times in history has violence been used in order to make certain that human rights could be protected? And even if you don't want to talk about gay rights, you want to talk about, say, Martin Luther King. Even Martin Luther King's peaceful protests were not seen as peaceful at the time. If you want to be the American patriot sitting in the back saying that you would never engage in violence against your country because that's unpatriotic, you would never do it to a police officer or anyone else, I have to ask you, what the fuck was the Revolutionary War? Turns out, violence may not solve everything. And in fact, it may not solve anything. But it is a tool that we need to recognize has its purpose within the political zeitgeist. If we accept the fact that there are certain people and organizations who will never be motivated by cunning rhetoric or opposing ideology, if those organizations seek out the elimination of minority groups, they seek out violence against them, then we owe it to ourselves to recognize that there's a tool at our dispense. And if you want to continue to say that violence has no place in anywhere, and it should not be used to respond to speech, I want to agree with you. But I think violence and speech are on the exact same spectrum, and they are on a scope. And speech can become violence as that scope shifts. Groups of Proud Boys and Oath Keepers don't position themselves outside of drag shows randomly. They do so because an entire information machine has been used to incite them to do so. And incitement is done with words. Threats are done with words. So hopefully I've given you a shit ton to think about. As a content creator and as somebody who abhors violence in general, I've said it before and I'll say it again, I cannot condone it. But I can take a step back and look at it analytically. And I can say that naive statements like violence against speech is never warranted ignores several types of speech that are categorically, scopeedly, forms of violence. Hopefully I've given you all a bunch of food for thought. Let me know what position on the fence you might have fallen on in this conversation. But I've done a lot of information dumping. So, I'll be interested to see the actual conversations that spark up as a result of this. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Subscribe if you haven't already. And as always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here.